Alright everyone, this week the other thing we want to talk about is the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. And this is particularly important for context because from the New Testament side of things, the context of the writing of the New Testament is growing out of the Old Testament. For the Old Testament, this conversation is important because we want to determine, is the New Testament also part of the context of the Old Testament, even though it's written after the Old Testament, or is the context just the Old Testament by itself, like Child's discrete witness? Most of this material is focused on understanding the New Testament in light of the Old Testament, so this lecture is going to be relatively brief. But I still want to hit this issue because it is an important issue in Old Testament theology, in that we're talking about whether or not the Old Testament is a discrete witness unto itself, or whether we need to include the New Testament in our understanding. So that's the first challenge of the New Testament in this issue of the New Testament's use of the Old Testament is, does the Old Testament have its own voice apart from the New Testament? Now, Childs is the person that tries to promote this idea the most, in that he wants to read the Old Testament as a discrete witness. And I think there is some validity here in that there are times where Christians have passed over the Old Testament in order to just go ahead and look at the New Testament, or view the Old Testament as sort of obsolete now that we have the New Testament. So I think there is some validity in saying we need to read the Old Testament on its own terms. The Old Testament does have its own voice, its own way of teaching us about God and Christ, its own way of describing the people of God. And if we just focus on the New Testament, we've lost something about Revelation, about how God has revealed himself. On the other hand, I view the Bible as one book. It's one entire book from beginning to end, and we can't ever actually separate in our minds one part of it from a different part. We can study, Genesis or Judges or Deuteronomy or whatever by itself, and we can look at it on its own terms, but it's almost as if the rest of the canon is always in our peripheral vision. And we can't block that out. We don't have blinders like horses where we don't see to the sides. And to the one side of the Old Testament is the New Testament. We cannot, as Christians, read part of the Bible as if we don't know how it ends. So on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to what Childs is saying in that I don't want Christians to just pass over the Old Testament and not hear its own voice. On the other hand, I think that Childs sort of swings the pendulum too far in one direction by saying we should sort of carve out our reading of the Old Testament without ever hearing the New Testament until we've done our work in the Old Testament. I don't think that's possible as Christians. So this is a challenge for Old Testament theology. You're going to get people who say things differently than me, and that's okay. I mean, we can disagree on this. I'm of the opinion, though, that task to put blinders on to where we don't see the New Testament is actually impossible. So I think the Old Testament has its own voice, but it's never a voice that's heard apart from its location within the one voice of Scripture. Another issue in the New Testament's use of the Old Testament is the debate about how the New Testament uses the Old Testament. Is it actually accurate? And so these are some of the debates that rage on about this issue. Each of these is trying to say that the New Testament doesn't use the Old Testament in a way that accurately reflects the original meaning of the Old Testament text. So, in other words, in this view right here, that there are some Jewish interpretive practices that arose in the Second Temple period, and some scholars would say, wait a minute, the New Testament just the New Testament authors just used the interpretive practices of their time to interpret the Old Testament. It doesn't actually reflect an accurate understanding of the Old Testament. It's just they were using the interpretive practices of their time. The testimony book debate says that all the New Testament authors did was just collect a bunch of different verses that they thought pointed to Christ, and then they collected them into a testimony book, and they just used them over and over again. They didn't actually get these verses because they pointed to Christ. It was just they thought they did, and they collected them in a book and then used them subsequently in their own writing. The Christocentric debate says that the New Testament authors read the Old Testament Christocentrically after the resurrection. So they didn't read the Old Testament Christocentrically before the resurrection, but an event, a way of reading, changed the way they read the Old Testament. So it wasn't as if this Christocentric reading was jumping off the page at them as much as it is they read the New Testament with new lenses after the resurrection. Then you have the rhetorical debate where people argue that, for instance, in Galatians 4, Paul is just using the Hagar-Sarah story rhetorically. He's not using it in a way that accurately reflects what Moses was doing in that text. It's just a rhetorical device. And then you have people claiming that, a text doesn't actually have a meaning. They were just using these texts for their own devices, this postmodern idea that we've moved beyond authorial intent to just understanding texts in the way that we want to understand them. Now, I don't think any of these are right. I think the New Testament authors do very careful biblical interpretation. They're seeing how the Old Testament authors have a purpose in mind, how they intertextually relate each book to one another, and so some of the times when it feels like they're ripping a verse out of context, or it feels like they're just using verses for their own purposes, if we look closer at the actual Old Testament text, to its context, to its intertextual links to other Old Testament books, we see that no, the New Testament authors actually were getting the Old Testament right. The Old Testament is Christological. The Old Testament is intertextually related to itself. The Old Testament does push us forward in the narrative towards the Messiah, and the New Testament does get it right. They're not just collecting disparate texts. They're not just using Jewish methods. They're not just post ipso facto reading this Christologically. They're not just using it rhetorically. They're not just importing their own meaning onto it. They are doing what the Old Testament authors wanted them to do and seeing Christ in all of the Old Testament. We also have the issue of typology. I'm going to sort of fly from here because these are more issues in New Testament theology than in Old Testament, but we're still going to go over them. Typology, let me just put it this way. For Old Testament theology, what we want to see is how we recognize these types in the Old Testament. And I'll just give you an example. These types grow organically throughout Old Testament books, and the way that this happens, what you'll see is, for instance, Adam to Joseph. Adam is made in the image of the king. He's clothed in the image of the king. He's given a wife by the king, God. He is given land to rule over by the king. He is the second in command to the king, and he's fruitful. He bears fruit and grows in number. When we get to Joseph at the end of Genesis, Joseph is given a land by the king. Joseph is clothed in the image of the king, in that he is given a signet ring and some other things that would help people recognize that he's in the image of the king. He's given a wife by the king. He is second in command to the king, and he grows in number. That's what Joseph means, is number. He grows in number, just like Adam does. And so Joseph is presented as this type of Adam. He is a new Adam. And we see that type actually mirrored both in Mordecai and Esther and in Daniel. Both Mordecai and Daniel, the same types of things happened to them that happened to Joseph and that happened with Adam to begin with. And so we see this sort of new Adam motif type growing throughout the Old Testament. And so when we talk about typology in the Old Testament, what we're talking about is the biblical authors using previous characters, previous people, and previous texts to build their own picture of the current person. And they link them textually and narratively. And that's what a type is. It's not just sort of random historical correspondence that can only be attributed to the providence of God, although it's true that it is attributed to the providence of God. It's also a literary device where these Old Testament authors are using previous people to paint the portraits of their current subject. I'm not going to go over this in detail at all. If you wanted to look into how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, the New Testament quotes the Old Testament. So in this verse it says this. It alludes to the Old Testament, so it doesn't have the quotation formula, but it does have sort of a paraphrase of an Old Testament text. And then Beale gives some suggestions for how to recognize an allusion. Richard Hayes also has this in his book, Echoes of Scripture and the Letters of Paul. And then you have echoes as well, which I didn't list there, which is sort of less than an allusion. It's sort of barely even an allusion. The purpose of these in the New Testament is to show promise and fulfillment. Okay, the Old Testament promises something here, it's fulfilled here. To instruct. So 1 Corinthians 10, this story was given for your instruction, Corinthians, particularly in issues of theology, and then also application. So Paul uses, the issue of idolatry to apply some stuff about the Lord's Supper and about idolatry in 1 Corinthians as well. So promise and fulfillment, instruction, application. In terms of the presuppositions of the New Testament authors, I'm actually just going to leave these here for you. This isn't a New Testament theology class, so I'm just going to leave these here for you to check out. And if you want to read Beale's handbook on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, that would be a great place to go to see these presuppositions and then to see how you should understand the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. So as we end here, what I want you to think about is, I know we just flew through this. If you go back and look at those steps sort of individually, how can that actually help us see how the Old Testament uses the Old Testament? How does understanding allusions, typology, quotation, how does that help us understand how the Old Testament uses the Old Testament? Because it's not just the New Testament that alludes and quotes the Old Testament. Old Testament books actually use and quote and allude to other Old Testament books. So just think about that at the end of this particular lecture.